And there was also a lot of stories about this island, maybe treasure or something like that. So it's a very, very special island. For Tahitian people, it was sacred. In 1967, Marlon Brando, yeah, that Marlon Brando, bought this private island and banned almost everyone from visiting. Now, after his death, we know why. They found ancient ruins, a mysterious shipwreck, and hundreds of secret recordings where he confessed things he never told anyone. But the most shocking discovery, the bizarre rules he created that still control the island today. This isn't just some celebrity hideaway, it's a place with secrets so wild, you won't believe they're real. Now, before we get into the dark heart of Brando's Island, let's rewind to where it all began. Because to understand the man, you gotta understand the boy he once was. And folks, this wasn't some fairy tale childhood. This was the kind of upbringing that either breaks you or makes you legendary. Marlon Brando was born April 3rd, 1924 in Omaha, Nebraska, and from day one, the cards were stacked against him. His father, Marlon Brando Sr., was a traveling salesman with a mean streak wider than the Mississippi. The man was colder than a Nebraska winter, calling his son stupid to his face, lazy behind his back. He'd disappear for weeks on sales, trips, then come home just long enough to make everyone miserable. Brando's mother, Dorothy, was the opposite. Warm, creative, the kind of woman who could light up a room. But she had her demons too, drowning them in bottles of gin. There were nights young Marlon would have to walk down to the local bars, dragging his drunken mother home while neighbors watched and whispered. When Brando was 11, his parents split. Like a rotten piece of wood. His mother took him and his sisters, Jocelyn and Frances, to California, thinking the sunshine might heal their wounds. It didn't. 2 years later, his parents tried reconciling, moving the family to Libertyville, Illinois. Same house, same problems. His father's voice still cut like a knife. You'll never amount to anything. His mother still disappeared for days at a time, leaving Marlon to cook meals for his sisters when he could barely reach the stove. So how does a kid survive that kind of childhood? For Brando, the answer was performance. He became a master mimic, doing impressions of teachers, neighbors, even his own drunk mother. At school, he'd have classmates rolling in the aisles with his spot-on imitations. But here's the thing, it wasn't just for laughs. Every character he created was armor against the real world. When he became someone else, even for 5 minutes, he didn't have to be Marlon Brando, the kid with the drunk mom and the bastard father. High school was a disaster waiting to happen. Brando couldn't sit still, couldn't follow rules, couldn't stand authority. The stories vary. Some say he got expelled for riding his motorcycle through the hallways. Others claim it was for setting off firecrackers in the boys' bathroom. Whatever. The final straw was, by 1941, his father had enough. He shipped 17-year-old Marlon off to Shattuck Military Academy in Minnesota, thinking Army discipline would whip him into shape. Big mistake! Shattuck nearly broke Brando. The rigid schedules, the constant drills, the screaming officers. It was everything he hated. So he fought back the only way he knew how. Rebellion. He became the Academy's worst nightmare. Pulling pranks. That would make Ferris Bueller blush. His masterpiece, stealing the clapper from the school's bell tower and burying it 200 yards away in the dead of night. For weeks, no one could figure out why the bell wouldn't ring. When they finally caught him, the headmaster was ready to throw him out. But then, something unexpected happened. See, Shattuck had a theater program, and the drama teacher, a man named Earl Wagner, saw something in Brando that no one else did. Raw, untamed talent. Wagner let him star in plays, gave him real direction, for the first time in his life. For a few hours each week, Brando wasn't the troublemaker or the disappointment. He was an actor. And for the first time, he felt what it was like to be good at something. But old habits die hard. In 1943, after one prank too many, legend says he sneaked out after curfew to go dancing with local girls, Brando got the boot. The crazy part? His classmates actually signed a petition to get him reinstated. But Brando was done. At 19, with $50 in his pocket, he hopped a train to New York City and never looked back. Now here's where the story gets interesting, folks. Because New York in the 1940s was where legends were born. Brando crashed with his sister Jocelyn in a tiny Greenwich Village apartment, surviving on boiled potatoes and dreams. He enrolled at the New School's dramatic workshop, where he met Stella Adler, the woman who would change everything. Adler taught something called the method, a new way of acting that wasn't about pretending, but becoming. She didn't want performances, she wanted truth. When Brando played a homeless man, he lived on the streets for 3 days. When he did a scene as a boxer, he trained like one. Adler saw his potential immediately. "Most people act," she told him. "You are." For the next 3 years, Brando disappeared into his craft. He'd spend hours in the mirror, practicing facial expressions. He'd record himself reading lines, then play them back to analyze every pause, every breath. While other actors partied, Brando obsessively studied human behavior. How people walked, talked, even how they lied. By 1947, he was ready, and Broadway would never be the same. When Tennessee Williams' A Streetcar Named Desire opened December 3, 1947, no one was prepared for Brando's Stanley Kowalski. This wasn't acting, it was a force of nature. He'd based the character on real boxers he'd studied at Stillman's gym, copying their swagger, their animalistic energy. The way he ripped open his sweaty t-shirt, the way he bellowed "Stella" up those tenement stairs. It electrified audiences. Critics called it the birth of modern acting. Hollywood came calling immediately. But Brando? He wasn't interested. He hated the phoniness of Tinseltown, the fake smiles and empty promises. It would take 3 more years and a personal plea from director Fred Zinnemann to get him to Hollywood for his first film, The Men, 1950, where he played a paralyzed war vet. True to form, Brando spent a month in a wheelchair at a VA hospital, living with real paraplegics. When the cameras rolled, it wasn't Brando on screen, it was a broken soldier. The Hollywood old guard didn't know what to make of him. Studio heads complained he mumbled his lines. Co-stars hated that he refused to perform for the camera. But audiences, they couldn't look away. When A Streetcar Named Desire hit theaters in 1951, it cemented his status as the most exciting actor alive. That first Oscar nomination, it should have been his. But the Academy wasn't ready for Brando's revolution. Not yet. By 1954, Marlon. Brando wasn't just a movie star, he was a cultural earthquake shaking the foundations of Hollywood. And his performance in On the Waterfront would become the defining role of his career, the one that finally forced the Academy to hand him that golden statue. But the road there was anything but smooth, just like Brando himself. After the seismic impact of A Streetcar Named Desire, Hollywood didn't know what to do with him. He refused to play by the rules, showing up late to sets, rewriting scripts on the fly, and treating studio executives with the same disdain he'd once reserved for his father. Yet, when the cameras rolled, something miraculous happened. He transformed. In Viva Zapata, 1952, he didn't just play Mexican revolutionary Emiliano Zapata, he became him, spending months in Mexico studying the man's mannerisms, learning Spanish, and immersing himself in the history until even locals mistook him for one of their own. Critics raved, and the Academy handed him his second Oscar nomination. But Brando barely blinked. He was already on to his next challenge, tackling Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, 1953, as Mark Antony, a role that had theater purists sneering, until they saw his performance, a masterclass in controlled intensity that silenced every doubter. But it was The Wild One, 1953, that turned Brando from an actor into a legend, dressed in a leather jacket, tilted cap, and a sneer that defined rebellion. His Johnny Strabler wasn't just a character, he was an attitude, a middle finger to the post-war conformity of 1950s America. When his co-star asked, "What are you rebelling against?" and Brando lazily replied, "What do you got?" It became the battle cry for a generation. The film was banned in Britain for over a decade, blamed for juvenile delinquency, and Brando loved every second of the controversy. Yet, just as Hollywood thought they had him pegged, as the brooding rebel, he flipped the script again, shocking everyone by taking on Guys and Dolls, 1955, a musical of all things, playing smooth-talking gambler Sky Masterson opposite Frank Sinatra, who hated him for stealing the role he wanted, and proving he could sing, dance, and charm with the best of them. even if his voice wasn't exactly Broadway polished. Then came Sayonara, 1957, where he played an American soldier falling for a Japanese woman during the Korean War, a scandalous topic at the time, but Brando didn't care. He delivered a performance so tender and raw that it earned him yet another Oscar nomination, and when his co-star Miyoshi Umeki became the first Asian woman to win an Academy Award, he was the first to cheer, a rare moment of public warmth from Hollywood's most notorious loner. But behind the scenes, the cracks were starting to show. His reputation for being difficult was growing, and not without reason. He clashed with directors, ignored scripts, and treated acting less like a job and more like an experiment he could abandon if he got bored. That arrogance reached its peak during Mutiny on the Bounty, 1962, a film so cursed by Brando's behavior that it nearly sank an entire studio. He arrived on set overweight and unprepared, fired the original director, demanded constant rewrites, and cost MGM a then unthinkable $19 million, over $180 million today, turning what should have been a swashbuckling epic into a behind-the-scenes nightmare. Co-star Richard Harris called him a monster, and director Lewis Milestone swore never to work with him again. But the real tragedy? The film was beautiful. Stunning cinematography, grand sets, and at the center of it all, Brando's bizarre, whispery performance as Fletcher Christian, a choice so strange it baffled audiences and critics alike. The movie bombed, MGM nearly went bankrupt, and Brando's career entered a freefall. By the mid-60s, he was considered box office poison, a has-been before he'd even hit 40. His personal life was just as chaotic, his marriage to actress. Movita Castaneda collapsed when she locked their fridge to stop his binge eating. He chewed through the lock. And his affair with Mutiny co-star Tarita Terry Paya, 19 years his junior, became tabloid fodder. Meanwhile, his activism was heating up. He marched with Martin Luther King Jr., funded the Black Panthers, and openly criticized American imperialism, making him a hero to the counterculture and a villain to the establishment. By 1968, he'd had enough. He quit acting entirely, retreating to his newly purchased Tahitian island, Tetiaroa, a place he called the only paradise I've ever known. For 3 years, Hollywood assumed he was done, until a young director named Francis Ford Coppola came knocking with a role he swore only Brando could play, Don Vito Corleone in The Godfather, 1972. The studio hated the idea. Brando was unreliable, washed up, a liability, but Coppola fought like hell, and Brando, sensing one last shot at redemption, delivered a screen test so mesmerizing that Paramount had no choice but to cave. His Dons. Corleone wasn't just a performance, it was a resurrection. A whispered, calculating, utterly hypnotic portrayal that reminded the world why he was the greatest actor of his generation. When he won the Oscar, no one was surprised, but what he did next shocked everyone. He refused it, sending Native American activist Sachin Littlefeather to reject the award on his behalf, protesting Hollywood's treatment of indigenous people. The audience booed. John Wayne reportedly tried to storm the stage, and Brando, watching from home, just smiled. He'd made his point. But just when it seemed like he was back on top, he plunged into controversy again with Last Tango in Paris in 1973, a film so sexually explicit it was banned in several countries. And decades later, co-star Maria Schneider revealed that the infamous butter scene was non-consensual, a revelation that tarnished the film's legacy and Brando's reputation in the Me Too era. Yet, like always, Brando refused to apologize, moving on to his next act. A bizarre, brilliant, and often baffling late career that saw him demand $3.7 million for 12 minutes of screen time in Superman, 1978, show up overweight and unprepared, for Apocalypse Now, 1979, and deliver a haunting, improvised monologue about snails that became the film's most iconic moment. Through it all, Tetiaroa remained his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the chaos, the lawsuits, the scandals, and the grief that would soon consume him, because the darkest chapters of Brando's life were still to come, and they would involve a gun, a dead man, and a daughter lost too soon. Mourned his failures as a father, and revealed shocking confessions about his abusive childhood, his mother's alcoholism, and his lifelong struggle to feel anything beyond surface-level emotions. "I've spent my whole life pretending to feel," he confessed in one tape, because the real thing was too painful. His final years were a study in contradictions. too weak to walk without assistance, yet still scheming grandiose film projects, estranged from most of his children, yet paying for the college educations of strangers, battling creditors while secretly funding Native American activist groups, until July 1st, 2004, when pulmonary fibrosis finally stilled that legendary voice. At UCLA Medical Center, his death certificate listing not just his physical ailments, but the unspoken killer: a broken heart. The funeral was small, private, exactly as he'd wanted. No Hollywood eulogies, no posthumous Oscar tributes, just his remaining children, a handful of old friends like Jack Nicholson, and the haunting echo of all that wasted potential. Yet, the real drama began after the burial, when teams of lawyers and archaeologists descended on Tetiaroa to inventory Brando's estate and stumbled upon discoveries that would rewrite his legacy. Not just the expected treasures, original Godfather, scripts, love letters from Marilyn Monroe, but genuine historical artifacts, Polynesian ceremonial grounds predating European contact, a shipwreck from the 1800s half buried in the lagoon, and, most chillingly, a locked vault containing those infamous recordings, their contents so explosive the executors debated destroying them entirely. But that, the final act of Brando's saga, the secrets buried in the sand, the truth about what really happened on Tetiaroa, is a story so shocking, so unbelievable it deserves its own telling. And if you think you know the full truth about Hollywood's most enigmatic legend, trust me, you don't. When Marlon Brando took his final breath on that July evening in 2004, the world thought it had seen the last of Hollywood's most enigmatic rebel. But Tetiaroa, his secluded Polynesian paradise, was only just beginning to reveal its secrets, starting with the team of lawyers and archaeologists who arrived to assess the estate and quickly realized this was no ordinary celebrity retreat. Beneath the swaying palm trees and pristine beaches lay artifacts that rewrote both Brando's legacy and the island's history. Ancient Polynesian ceremonial stones, arranged in patterns suggesting human sacrifice, the sun-bleached wreckage of the Condor of Bermuda, a yacht that had mysteriously run aground in 1980, and, most chillingly, a concrete bunker hidden beneath Brando's main bungalow containing over 5,000 hours of audio diaries recorded between 1968 and 2003, their contents ranging from heartbreaking confessions to explosive Hollywood revelations. The tapes, meticulously labeled and stored in climate-controlled cases, revealed a Brando the public never knew. In one, he admitted faking his entire Godfather audition, basing Don Corleone's voice on a dying mobster he'd met in a 1950s New York diner. In another, he claimed to have sabotaged Mutiny on the Bounty intentionally, calling it revenge against the studio that blacklisted his activist friends. But the most disturbing recordings involved his family. Hours of self-loathing over Christian's crime. I gave him my temper, but not the tools to control it. Agonized rants about Cheyenne's suicide. They say time heals, but they're lying. Time just makes the pain familiar. And shockingly, a whispered confession that he'd known Dog Drolet wasn't abusive, but let Christian believe it to protect Cheyenne's fantasy. Yet, the island guarded even darker mysteries. Local workers refused to go near the northern Motu after dark, claiming they heard ghostly chanting, a phenomenon Brando had privately researched, even hiring anthropologists who discovered the area. Was once a tapu, sacred burial ground for Polynesian warriors. This spiritual energy, some say, explains the bizarre rules Brando instituted. No whistling at night, it called the ancestors, no touching certain black rocks, they remember blood, and a strict ban on removing any coral or shells, which he believed carried curses. The most puzzling discovery? A ship's logbook from the Condor wreck. Its final entry dated hours before the crash reading, "He knows we found it," alongside hand-drawn maps leading to a spot near the reef, where divers later uncovered rusted World War II-era crates, empty but stamped with Imperial Japanese insignia, fueling theories the island had been a secret resupply point for submarines, a history Brando allegedly knew and kept quiet to avoid disrupting Tetiaroa's fragile peace. As researchers combed through his archives, they found letters to French, Polynesian officials pleading against development, not for environmental reasons as he'd publicly claimed, but because he feared disturbing what sleeps here, a phrase he never explained. The truth about Brando's final years emerged through these fragments. Diabetic and wheelchair-bound, he'd obsessively monitored Tetiaroa's wildlife cameras, not for conservation as staff believed, but because he was convinced Cheyenne's spirit visited as a white tern, a local bird she'd loved, going so far as to build a small shrine filled with her childhood drawings, where he'd leave offerings of vanilla ice cream, her favorite. Meanwhile, Hollywood continued profiting from his legend, the Godfather video games, Brando-themed documentaries, even AI recreations of his voice, while the man himself had grown to despise acting, calling it the con that consumed me, in one tape and confessing he only took the score, 2001, to pay for Cheyenne's grandson's trust fund. The ultimate irony? The Brando Resort, opened in 2014 on Tetiaroa's safe eastern Motu, became the eco-luxury paradise he'd pretended to want. Solar-powered villas, marine research stations, even a library housing his film memorabilia. While the real Brando, according to his final tape made weeks before his death, believed the island would erase me like footprints in the tide. He was wrong. The more Tetiaroa gives up its secrets, the clearer it becomes. Brando wasn't just hiding on the island, he was hiding from it, from the ghosts of its past and the weight of his own. A man who spent a lifetime running only to discover too late that paradise isn't a place but a state of mind he could never inhabit. And if you listen closely when the wind stills and the birds go quiet on Tetiaroa's northern shore, some say you can still hear him. Not the Oscar winner, not the cultural icon, just a broken father whispering apologies to a daughter who can't. Hear him. And so, the legend of Marlon Brando, the man who changed acting forever, the rebel who defied Hollywood, the broken father who lost his way, ends not with a spotlight, but with whispers in the wind on a lonely island. The tapes, the ruins, the curses, the ghosts, they all paint the same picture. A genius who spent his life searching for something real, only to find that the greatest performance of all was the one he couldn't stop playing. Himself. But here's the thing about secrets, folks. They always find a way to surface. And if Brando's Island taught us anything, it's that the past never stays buried. So tell me this. What other Hollywood legends are hiding truths this explosive? What's really buried in those studio vaults, locked in those celebrity diaries, or hidden on other private islands? That's where you come in. Smash that subscribe button right now. Because this was just the beginning. We've got more untold stories, more shocking confessions, and more real history that'll make your jaw drop. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Tap the bell, join the hunt, and let's uncover the truth together.